There we
Hey,
go.
Katie, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I've been trying to get a hold of you for quite a while now, so I'm really happy to finally be having a conversation with you. And in some ways, I feel like I know you. I've listened to your book, Move Your DNA, which you recorded actually the audio for that. So I've
Hmm.
I've listened to that book twice through in a row, and then in preparation for this interview, the book Rethink Your Position. I just finished that the other day, and I found them all to be extremely helpful. So, if you don't mind, can you give everyone just a little bit of a background on your background in biomechanics, and then kind of how we got us to this interview today?
Yeah, my name is Katy Bowman. I'm a biomechanist, and that's just someone who studies. Uh, I guess it's always good to give the context of where biomechanics sits. So, kinesiology is the
Hmm.
study of human movement, but there's a lot of branches to kinesiology. It's sort of an odd duck as far
Yeah.
as a path of study goes, because there's exercise physiology, which is looking at the
Hmm.
effects of um, and the systems of the body, the physiology that are affected by and are like what um, creates our ability to do exercise. And then there's sports
Completely.
psychology, the psychology part of it, how the brain is
Hmm.
at play. And then there's pedagogy, which is people who go into teaching physical education. So looking at it through an academic and how do we get this and scale it to different grades and teach it as something that everyone should know. And then there's biomechanics. And biomechanics is it's probably most akin to exercise physiology, where it's looking at physical systems, but it's looking at really the effect of physical forces that are both created through movement and how we are also moved by physical forces, right? Because it's just how the mechanical environment
Hmm.
is affecting the biological system. And so biomechanics is a very broad field. It can go
Yeah,
through
because I
any.
think when people think biomechanics, they often kind of jump right to the muscles and the bones and
Sure.
the levers and the pulleys that sort of drive that system. But then I'm sure you view it from you kind of layer all of those things together. So how does the nervous system play the role in biomechanics, for example, or how do our energy systems feed into how we can take on stresses?
And even
Is that correct?
how does our external environment affect, like things like sitting, like that's not really moving any particular
Hmm.
bone, joint, muscle combination once you get into the position. And yet, if you think about the body as more than just levers and pulleys, if you get down to the cellular level, it's like, well, now we're sort of in the philosophical of like, what is movement? Like when something moves in the body,
Oh,
isn't it because all the cells have adjusted their shape to accommodate this larger movement? So I do agree with what you're saying. We think of more like joint kinematics, and we call that
absolutely.
biomechanics. And it's certainly in the
Part of it.
purview, and it's evolved, but it's not the only thing that's going on.
Hmm. I know. I don't think it does it justice when we kind of just view it that way, because to
Sure.
your point, the forces that are going through the body when sitting, especially for prolonged periods of time, then change your ability for those cells to be used and manipulated in other environments. Then,
And
so
flow rates, like how is the blood flow being affected by this whole particular thing, which we would not necessarily put that into joint kinematics, but yet they're
mhm,
directly related. And so all of this stems from the issue of needing to take a complex subject and then breaking it down into classes that you take over years, and when do you award a degree, right? So
yes,
we shouldn't let the schooling system um, be our only way we view a thing. Like
completely.
that's just how it's been broken down to distribute information for people who want to on ramp into knowing. And there's a lot of different on ramps into knowing, and some people have picked certain things that they deem as most important, and certainly those will change over time, right? Like what was
Hmm.
really important, people knew about their body, turns out that they totally forgot things like emotional well-being, like all these other pieces,
Yes.
and then that comes online for our understanding, and then we go back and we're like, well, curriculum can only fit into 4 years, so what do? We're gonna have to take away something else to add this in. And so you're always trying to figure out what are the
Yes.
essential blocks, and as we know more, it's almost like our education covers less, and you have to do more after the fact of doing your base education because there's just so much to
Hmm.
know.
So a topic that we learned in physical therapy school, or we covered, was mechanotransduction. And so like
Hmm.
the mechanical forces that you put through the cells then impact how those cells sort of end up. And I think that is so clear when we talk about it from a strength training standpoint. We kind of neglect that when it comes to walking or sitting all day and things like that. And I'm wondering if you could help the listener sort of, how can we start thinking about mechanotransduction as sort of every part of our lives? Because that really impacts the long-term effect of how our body and our joints feel, when we're 60, 70, and 80 years old.
Well, I mean, mechanotransduction is just a process. So it's just a word that is trying to to communicate this idea that when you push or pull or twist, or when you apply some sort of mechanical force to a cell, that cell converts that mechanical push or pull or twist or shear
Yes,
or bend
yes.
or whatever compression
Hmm.
into a set of chemical signals. So the mechanical
Completely.
becomes a chemical, which then goes on to affect the resultant behavior of that particular
Hmm.
cell. And then that cell, we'll just say adapts, right? It like learns and it adjusts, and then it
Yes.
becomes more able to do the thing that its environment has sensed it needs to do. So, I mean, it's just a sense, right? It's this idea of
It is.
learning.
It's your sense of touch. Like,
It's
yes,
a sense of touch. It is
yes.
the sense of touch. And um, something else that would help, I think, the listener and everyone just understand, because I don't think it's just only for movement professionals, physical therapists, every human. This is going on 100% of the time.
Hmm.
You are in a gravitational field 100% of the time. And your position, I mean, what constitutes good form doing an exercise is that it elicits the adaptation that we would like to see on the other side, right? Like,
Yes.
I know that this joint would be better supported if you could elicit this particular
Hmm.
balance of strength over the joint so that you're not wearing too hard on this side and not enough on this side. But we are always mechanically transducing our body, and our body's always just going, what are you asking me to do so I
Yes.
can adapt to it? And
And
so,
you
yeah, go ahead.
explain that so well in the book. And I'm sorry for cutting you off there once or twice, but
It's better.
how you talk about it from a barefoot shoe standpoint or using a pillow standpoint, like all of those things in subtle ways are the forces that are then impacting, let's say with the shoe example, how much stress goes through your Achilles tendon and up to the gastroc. And then that translates into how much that can handle sort of with a higher velocity of load or something like that. I mean, I think, but so what confuses me is how can we not get more and more people thinking and talking this way? Because I feel like that's at the heart of where a lot of disease comes from.
Sure. So, like a physio is going to be like, okay, I need this joint to go through these ranges of motion, be able to support this amount of force, like this much weight or whatever it is that you're trying to
Hmm.
do. We could think about our whole body being something that we can look at it as in terms of a whole body positioning. I need my body to be able to hold its weight while I'm standing upright. And
Yes.
then you look at, okay, well, what sort of forces are you transducing most of the time? Most of your forces are sitting. So there's something that's happening to the muscular support systems that would hold you up when you're standing, the joints' ability to withstand, the bone density. All these things are more adapted to your sitting position. You've changed your anatomy to reflect how to make sitting easier on your body. And
Hmm.
so all these other movements sort of fade away. Like your ability to do a lot of movements just fades away because you're more strongly adapted, more practiced in these other movements. If we called everything a movement, I think it'd be less confusing. Like you're
Yes.
never
And
not moving.
breathing, like, yes, all the simplest things. So, and in the clinic, I break that down to the term of, for simplicity's sake, of like muscle memory. So like your muscles have been sitting, let's say, in this position for a long time. So the anterior shoulder remembers this more forward position. So then if we ask you to reach back and open up there, you can't drop down as much because those muscles haven't been primed as recently. So
Yeah.
is muscle memory, is that would that be a safe or catch-all way to talk about some of this stuff?
Well, I think I mean, that depends on whom you're talking to.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think that for me, I really talk about it in terms of adaptation, because to me, you're not going back because you don't remember how to go back. Sometimes there is a physical limitation that is created through your adaptation. And I think that that way of understanding it helps us understand why it takes so long. Why does it take so long? Because it doesn't take very long to remember. You can remember in an instant. You can forget in an instant. It's more like there have been physical changes due to your habitual way of using your body. And so we're trying to coax new you. So it takes time to let some old anatomy go, right? Because if you're a runner, what makes it hard to start running after not running for a long time, or do anything that has a lot of endurance demand when you haven't done that for a while, is you do not own in your body enough capillaries.
Yes.
You don't have the anatomy. It's not like you're just sitting there with a rigid anatomy that's being used yes or no. Like, your anatomy is being written and shaped by what you do. So why you hit that wall so fast is sometimes quite mechanical. It's not that you don't have the memory of running, really. I mean, I guess you're talking about more like, when you say memory, it's more like there's no trace left of these pathways you used to take. So in that way, yes. But I do think it's less of a brain thing, and it's more of an anatomy thing.
Completely.
Well, it's brain in the body. I mean, it's, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, you just simply don't have the parts yet. And that could be sarcomeres. It could be not just things getting looser. Sometimes, yes, but it might not only be that, like, we are trying to we're trying to add nutrients to the bones, right? They are sitting there without particular nutrients. Like, we need to add those nutrients to that particular spot, or those minerals, this mass.
And like a physical stress theory sort of way, the type of tissue that's taking on the demand is going to respond in a similar amount of time based on what type of cell we're working with. So a bone might, like skin cells are very replaceable cells, where the nervous system cells take a lot longer to, like, the mechanical forces are going to have to mold around that. I mean, I use my own scars in my body as a way to understand those things.
Sure.
So something I wanted to ask you about was the physical therapy world and the pain management world has really gone to a top-down perspective of viewing and understanding pain, whereas it's the brain that drives all of this behavior. And I think that it's very true because of how the brain interprets pain, but I feel like the body's input and the mechanical senses that we're taking into the body, play an equally important role in how we understand pain. Do you, something, so like the message kind of gets blurred. We'll say in physical therapy, we want you to be able to move in all directions. So flexion through the low back is not a problem. Or like the first thing on the back of your book is avoid tech neck. Well, in the PT world, that received a texting neck isn't a real thing. Like, pain from your head being forward isn't the cause of the pain, because the pain is centrally driven. And I feel like there needs to be a better conversation. I know I can see you rolling your eyes around
conversation. Yeah.
And because we take it as, well, then it's fine to be here. And I think the conversation needs to be, it's okay to be there. And we also need to be strong in these other ways. But the research is having a hard time sort of fleshing out the complexity of that.
Well, or maybe the research isn't, but the integration of research is. So it's like I was saying before with the schooling part. So the understanding of like social, emotional impacts on pain, that's fairly new for many people to understand. So then it goes into the curriculum and it's like, oh, this is pain. There's no mechanical part to pain at all. Like, there's no physical signs that your body would give you that you're breaking down a tissue, that you've exceeded a capacity. That's all in your head. And so then that replaces the old overly mechanized model that didn't acknowledge it. When in fact, I would say that it's both.
Completely.
But to do both would to double everything. So we do have a way of, when we find a new thing, a new tissue, a new body part that we hadn't thought of, that becomes the most important thing. And all of that was wrong. Like, we have a hard time integrating.
Period.
Just straight up. Period.
Yes.
Like, it's like we just can replace the top hierarchy thing. There's never any just more new, not never, but I have just seen that discussion happen over and over again. And so your point, like tech neck is not forward flexion. It is not the position. Tech neck is the rigidity of the position and the inability to get out of it. So tech neck is not like dowager's hump is not someone just sitting there in flexion and just can stand up and out of it anytime they want to. That's not what that is, right?
Because they've lost the ability to, maintain that upright posture afterwards.
So not only musculoskeletally, well, not only muscularly, it's not only necessarily a strength. You can now have bone density changes where the bone would not be able to support the weight in any other position but forward, and thus the cycle perpetuates. And so, yes, I do think it is a slippery slope to start saying there's no problem with any position. But I don't think that's sort of almost a straw man, because I don't know how many people are saying that there is a problem with any position. The problems that we are discussing is about what's happening tissue-wise, what's happening like physiologically and anatomy-wise with high volume, repetitive positioning in the absence of lots of other movements. I don't know how many people are not understanding that as the actual issue.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
I know it, but it kind of gets brought back to like, well, let's take flexion of the low back, for example. So like if someone's having back pain, we say, well, flexion of the low back is not a problem. And I'm like, it's not a problem. We do need to be able to flex the low back.
Right.
But the second part of that statement should be, but learning how to use your butt muscles with the hip hinge technique and driving through your hamstrings is a lot stronger, biomechanically efficient position. Well, and I feel like we forget that second part.
Well, then there is no part with flexion of the lumbar spine, but taking all of your steps every day in a flex spine is mechanically compromising that area. And when you do it for a decade or 5 decades, there are just issues that are like this. There are just issues that can be coupled with that particular position, but it's not the position itself. It's what happens in that position. So for example, what can happen in that position is, as I wrote in Rethink Your Position, it's very hard to create a glute contraction in this particular position, because so many of these ways of getting these muscles to be firing and contributing day to day is based on form. In the same way that you need a particular form to elicit a particular EMG when you're doing an exercise, there's a form to doing activities of daily living that elicit the EMG where you want it to be. And someone to go through and have their primary driving force to be like erector spinae, or a very small region of the spine again and again and again, it's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable.
I completely agree, especially if the goal is capacity as you get older, like, because your level of function is going to get smaller and smaller if that's your only movement strategy.
And I think also to further tie in though, that emotional, that whatever you want to call it, the brain or whatever you want to call it, is there also is a relationship between what's going on in our head and what's going on in our body. And sometimes those can even be mechanical. Like the relationship between what's going on in your mind and mechanical can also be there. So meaning to only look at trying to solve the mechanical part of the mechanical problem without looking at how the mind is tying into the mechanical problem would also be to not address the mechanical problem fully.
Can you delve into that a little bit more? Because I understand what you mean. Whereas like if someone's in a forward shoulder posture and they're at work and they're stressed, like their body is holding tension in that position associated with the emotional stress of it. But what do you mean? So there's the emotional part, but what's the mechanical part of the central nervous system?
Well, I'll think of like I'll use my dog as an example, and I'm classic KB explanations on purpose use non-human models. So I use plants, I use animals because it's a lot easier because we think of ourselves as something really different. So if my dog has been in a very traumatic experience, my dog's posture will be a certain, I can read her posture, right? If you've spent any time with dogs,
anybody, yes.
You know, if you speak dog, you understand how the stress shows up in the shape, and you learn to read the shape. Now, she gets in a shape that's similar to her stressed out shape in other times too. She could be in that shape when she's going to the bathroom. She could be on that shape when she's playing, when she's digging and having fun. So it's to keep the nuance of what I'm saying right now. So the shape does not infer the emotional state, but the emotional state can create a particular predictable shape that I can learn to read like a pattern in her.
Beautiful. I've tried to wrap my head around that for so long.
So just use the dog as an example, and make sure you don't make a converse error, which is to assume the shape always infers the other part.
Yes.
So she would never, like, her being very, I'll just use traumatized, whether it's fireworks or a dog attack or something that she's very scared of, the shape is always the same. But like I said, that shape, she can be in that particular shape for other reasons.
Yes.
Too. And I think what happens is we don't add that second part in. It's like, oh, everyone has this shape. Like, no, there's a lot of different reasons. But when she has this shape, I could not coax her into an anterior pelvic tilt. Her posterior tilt is there. I couldn't be like, let's work with your anterior. I couldn't keep her in the environment that she's in, whether she's actually in it or she's remembering it, or she's being triggered by something else. I couldn't coax her into a different physical shape. I could give her all the exercises, but she's going to keep pulling back in that shape because somewhere in her physiology is still this relationship with this thing that she's going through. And so I think that many times, what I do think so much of the research about pain being, I'll say, in our mind doesn't appreciate is that there's a relationship also between the physical, and it being in the mind really doesn't necessarily diminish it, that it can be something happening in the body that's being triggered by the mind. I guess I
was thinking about that, like, you know, the term interoception. Like, I'm trying to figure out because I understand exactly what you're saying, but because I was thinking it's like your internal sense of how your self is doing, which is like a different sense than hearing and seeing something. So it's like, I think you did a very nice job explaining that, because I think it's a tricky subject that we are just almost throwing out with PT type topics. And I think it's doing us a disservice. And I think there needs to be that interplay between understanding the two of those. For
sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll just leave it at that. Yes. And I think that we like to go deep in a single thread and not work on another way of expanding, which is to connect a lot of the deeper threads to each other.
So do you see clients one-on-one, correct?
Not really anymore. I spend a lot of time doing that. I mean, I work with a lot of individual bodies, but I have sort of shifted to your earlier question. You're like, I think more people should know. I think more people should know what we would previously think of as practitioner only like, I think that there was an idea that only practitioners are people pursuing degrees in the body or in healing or like making things better in the body, that only those people would be interested or able to extract the information and integrate it and apply it. And I think that every person has the ability to extract a very large toolkit on their own mechanics and loads.
Completely.
And so that's really what I do most of the time, is like, how can I take some of this information that arises when you investigate more deeply and spend a lot of time learning, any science or learning anything. You just have a deeper appreciation of it, the deeper you go and the more detail you know. And then I like to integrate it. And then I like to change some of the language which I feel can be a barrier for a lot of people to recognize what often is just simply something easy to grasp, but has a lot of jargon behind it, and try to teach, I'll say laypersons, although I would say 50% of the people who come to me are actually professionals who want help with the integration as well. And who also,
I know what you mean.
Jargon-free. They want the dog example because that's another hallmark of a science can be the jargon, but after a while, everyone just forgets what the jargon it's hard to drill down. Give me the examples, not the equations. I need 20 examples before that equation can stick and I can apply it as a principle. So that's what I've really spent my time doing the last 15 years.
See, because a lot of this stuff it's mechanical input to the body, which is our sense of feeling. So understanding the pressure, compression, tension, shearing, understanding all of that, the integration of that, you were talking about the different types of knowing earlier. And like, you can read this stuff on a textbook, but I think when it comes to movement, at least what I've found in the clinic, is that you need to teach the person how to feel that. And all of that mechanical input is associated with a feeling. And so like I do manual therapy here. Like I'll do a combination of hands-on work on the table and then exercise stuff. But the hands-on work on the table is to teach them sort of what their muscles should be doing, so then they can have something to grab onto when we're doing that same thing in a squat position or in a deadlift or something like that.
Well, and that's why I would never separate, this is in your head, not in your body. I'm like, that whole, they're trying to explain a different mechanism of pain instead of the very simple, like, oh, you have a herniated disc and that's why you feel the way you do. But then they find people with herniated discs who don't feel anything. People who feel the same feelings who don't have a herniated disc. So then that means, okay, we have a lot more on the table than we thought we did, which is we're more complex than we're just more complex than a simple model can ever explain.
So in your book, Rethink Your Position, something that you would go back to like at the end of every chapter is, so pay attention. And I think that is like where the heart of it's at. Is like,
that's the mind part. That's the mind part.
Because you need to, when you're doing a move, like what I am telling my clients all the time is that if we're doing a movement to open up your chest, you should feel that stretch in your chest. And like a lot of times they'll be like, oh, well, the back of my shoulder was really cramping up. And I'm like, well, if the purpose of this movement is to open up the anterior chain here, that's where I think that like that's where the movement should be felt in the body. But by giving them access to think about where that movement should be, it helps them have some framework around how that joint works and how things should be opening up then. So you see some clients one-on-one, but when you're investigating someone's pain, what type of questions are you asking that will guide you to how to help them solve the problem?
Well, I try to not make pain the problem. I guess that's my particular approach. And I can, like, this is like, I feel like pain is sort of, for many of us, transient and inevitable. So I just shift the conversation a little bit, which would be like, what is this pain keeping you from doing? So we kind of ground it more in the not being, I mean, I've been in pain to be like, man, I would give anything for this pain to stop. And I am not someone in chronic pain for whom pain has eclipsed all other elements of life. But I have been in severe pain where I really can't do anything else. It's been for a shorter period of time, even though up as long as a month, where it's like, there's nothing you can do that makes it go away. Like I've been on some spectrums, but anyway,
yes.
This is just to say what I try to keep anchoring to is, what do I want to be doing with my body eventually, or, when I get to the other side of the pain, or just in a year or in 5 years. I just try to ground whatever I'm doing more towards that, because oftentimes pain, when it's not sitting in the overwhelming like chronic pain category, but like, for example, I'll use myself, like foot pain is keeping me from walking. It's keeping me from, I can make a list of the things that I would like to be doing that I can't right now. And then from that,
is that actually true?
It is actually true. So I have just been through I injured my foot. And I can talk about if you want, if people are not bored by it, like how it came to be and then what I did to get out of it, because that would be my approach.
With
That would be
everyone.
what's that? It would.
I totally agree.
The
Yes.
challenge though is, so I'll just give a brief overview. Like I was
I
living
would
in,
like that.
yeah, I was living in Central America. So I went, and I was already someone who was always shod in minimal shoes, so not really rigid shoes, and also oftentimes just in bare feet. I have very strong feet. I can backpack
Mhm.
30 miles, wearing 30-pound backpack in the Olympic mountains, wearing a flexible sandal. Like I have very strong feet and legs. I went to Central America where I lived for 4 months, and mechanically there were a lot of things that happened that I believe led to where I ended up. One was I went from more mountainous terrain to flat and level. So I lost a lot of support strength on my legs because my training program went from always flat and level. Then everything inside, like my home was all cement floors. So I was on unshod, so barefoot because it was 100 over 100 degrees in flat and level concrete floors where I could really feel the impact of just being barefoot on cement. When I wasn't on cement, I was on sand, and I started walking, 5 to 7 miles a day in either bare feet or unshod. Now I had done that here, but in more complex terrain. So that means that you're not getting the same ankle foot load, right? That's the nice thing about terrain as it shifts underfoot is where your foot hits the ground varies. But I got myself in a situation where the same part of my foot was hitting the ground, and it was hard cement at that, coupled with cement, with sand, which really like just challenged the ranges of motion. And I was carrying supplies. So just a lot more walking and carrying. So I had done that for 4 months. I could tell my feet were just getting more stiff and sore the next day. And then I picked up a jump rope, something I had done before, but I hadn't done in like a year. And I jumped 600 times barefoot on tile. And that, I don't think if I had picked up that jump rope on the tile with my feet as they were here, it would have been a problem. But in that particular situation, it was. So that's me explaining why I don't think it was about the mode or activity that I was doing or even the barefoot situation. It was the context of the whole entire thing.
Is it like a metatarsal head sort of pain as you?
No, it was like heel. And it was not like there was no immediate, like acute popping or tearing. I think it was more plantar fascial sprain on I have one ankle where the subtalar joint just sits slightly askance that I'm always having to work on. And so just repetitive loading in there. And I thought it was a stone bruise or heel bruise. And it could be both. It could have been some heel bruise and a plantar fascia tear. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but I knew that within a couple days, I was, practically immobile on that side. And yet still living in a place where I had to walk everywhere and deal with it using the toolbox that I had. And I'm 3 months down the road now. What's that?
You're 3 months out of being.
I'm 3 months out of that now.
Okay.
But that's how long it's taken. That's how long it's taken me to get to the point where I would say I was someone in daily pain with every step and sort of compromised from doing. I'm a long distance walker. Like that's my sport, right? If I was like, that means like 20 to 30 miles at a time. So like cut that out, and it cut a lot of my longer walks out. But I just put myself through the training program that I would recommend for anybody, and like carry on 3 months later. Yeah.
So now 3 months later, are you, aside from, the gradual progress of walking and, being more back to your normal terrain, do you do stuff like rolling your foot out on a ball or icing your feet and stuff like that? What the traditional sort of, like, what other things do you use to help influence that mechanical environment or get those cells to respond quicker?
I stay moving. So like that's the biggest, that's my biggest approach is immobilization will almost never be my choice for addressing a particular issue. Now, I've got a tremendous amount of skill in knowing how to stabilize certain parts and let other parts move. And I think because most people don't have that, don't move at all, it's why that messaging drops down, is because you have to move so mindfully.
Yes.
And apply the forces exactly where you want them. So I could essentially do PT on myself all the time. Like I never actually stopped walking ever. I always managed to do 3 to 4 miles a day. They were slower and I had to get a stiffer shoe. Like I went for something that applied more stability. And then I also wanted to keep movement up, and I switched to like cycling as an exercise so that I could keep moving and keep my general fitness up and not go down that slope of being immobile when it was really just my foot that needed to break from pressure above, you know? So I came up with that. And then yes, so a lot of mobility work, but not really at the point. What I also noticed was like, because when an injury goes for so long, now you have to deal with the side effects of still ambulating with that injury. So then I noticed like, okay, there goes my right knee because I'm still walking, but I've shifted my entire gait to overload other parts the way that they shouldn't be loaded. And yes, they can be loaded, but 3 months down the road, this is how they feel, whether it's my mind or not. I can feel things crunching and I can feel things slipping and popping. It's like, okay, I've adapted to this. So a lot of my daily work was straightening my gait back out, trying to keep the part that I've been working too hard, give that a little smoothing out, whether it was like ball rolling or just targeted stretching and targeted strengthening. And then the same thing goes from that foot area. But I had to go not just with the foot, all the way up in the hip. Like, it's never just the foot. But at that point, it's the hips.
And do you think that's purely a mechanical force thing? I always seem to draw that back to like a reflexive neural tension response, almost from like the nerves that extend down into the heel as they, like that tightness is that, or like the nervous system's input as it goes into the spinal nerve root becomes a source of guarding for like the whole limb. So then like hip flexion or flexion, basically all movements of the hip then are going to start feeling some version of that lack of movement down at the foot and ankle. But is that like, yeah, okay.
I guess I don't know how I would differ. Like, to me, I don't know how one would separate the nerve from mechanical.
Yes, I'm actually,
the nerve.
You know what I mean? Like, with you. I do.
Yeah. So I don't really know when people use that language, what exactly they're trying to say, because
I think it's more of our patterned learning. We learned something as a muscle stretch versus a neural tension. And I feel like, to your point, the neural component, the input of that neural is all mechanical. So I think that is.
How do you stretch a nerve without stretching how do you stretch a nerve without stretching a muscle? Like, there is no real targeted, isolated things for that. But that being said, why it works, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what is the chicken, what is the egg. And I'm not sure.
How I would tease it out is like, I'll take people up into a 90-90 sort of hamstring stretch, and they'll be like, I feel a little bit of stretch, but then I'll dorsiflex and evert their foot, and then they get the whole neural chain stretch. So it's kind of like we're adding more to the position than just the origin insertion of the hamstring. I'm bringing in the foot component, which tensions the sciatic nerve and its connecting branches down into the foot.
Right, but it also adds in all of the calf muscles too at the same. It's hard to tease that out because you're adding so many more muscles and tissues to that particular stretch that an increase in sensation to me wouldn't even indicate that it was necessarily a nerve, because you've added more muscle into that stretch. You've added more fascia into that stretch. You've added more. So I guess I just never quite know.
I think it's not a worthwhile conversation, because I was going to ask you, how do you view nerve tension versus fascial sort of tightness? But I think I have a really hard time describing those things, because I think they're so much one and the same.
And how would anyone really know that's what they were doing one over the other? Like, I assume, I think of it more like my arm doesn't want to go into this position. Why it doesn't want to go, I don't know. Like, I don't have the sophisticated ability to measure what's happening internally. But I guess if you do know, the nerve can be resistant to changing its position. The muscle can be resistant to changing its position. The fascia could be resistant to changing its position. Good news for you, when it changes position, all of those have to change positions. So you don't really have to tease it out as much. So I would, I just have my way of moving through. And I think using things like active versus passive, like where you're letting someone control and explore and move pieces around. I'm much more like, a lot of time I like things very linear when I'm doing particular stretches, so that people can see, how do I want to say this? I think what's most often overlooked in clinical assessments is the subtle rotation of joints that make it seem like a body part is going farther than it is. Like the fact that the hand can get back, but did you notice that that a lot of that forward motion came because of the rib cage had to rotate backwards, and the scapular lifted, and you had a slight internal rotation of the, like when you start seeing that, just that you can get back, you can get your arm back behind you in a myriad ways. You've got to nail it down if you're trying to figure out where exactly the limitation is happening. You've got to hold some pieces static. And that's what I spend a lot of time doing, is making sure you're actually looking at the movement you thought you were looking at. Because rarely is it just your arm back, right? It's like you're trying to see, is a glenohumeral joint doing something?
Now, can I stop you there for a second? Are there positions that, because and this is going to be, this is catchwords for people, but like, I feel like in that sense, there's some very strongest way to move sort of positions where, because almost always if I'm checking, I want to see how well can I be upright to the rib cage with a strong kind of neutral core position, to then assess how well the arm moves in all those ranges. When you are talking about isolating the pieces, do you generally want the rib cage in one position, or do you generally want a neutral spine for this stuff? And if so, why?
Can you ask that question in a different way? I just want to make sure.
I did. Where I want to finish off the interview today with is, with almost all clients, do you have sort of some fundamental positions that you want them to be able to achieve?
Or fundamental movements, not so much positions.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's, let's say if I put someone on their hands and knees, I would want to see what their anterior and posterior pelvic tilt is. I want to see what their spinal flexion and extension is as a whole. So, like you could have them do something like a cat and a cow, right? That's so common to have someone come down. Like, can you flex all the way into something like a rounded spine? And can you drop down all the way into a convex shaped curve?
Yes.
What I'm also interested in is, are those overly coupled? Meaning, okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to hold that upper spine position, but I want you to go back to pelvic tilting and vice versa. And what I find is people are lacking the finesse of movement. Their movements are overly coupled. They're clumped together, not just mechanically, but neurologically. Meaning when they go to recruit, the pattern is to bring all these pieces together. The pieces can move. We just saw that the pieces can move. They can't move independently. So I guess that would be a breakdown of how I would differ between.
I love that.
They're not stuck together
purely mechanically, structurally, yeah.
Structurally, yeah. Mechanically just means something different to a biomechanist.
Yes. I know.
They're not tethered structurally. Now they can be tethered structurally, and I can find that sometimes someone can't move because things are tethered, but they're tethered through habit. They're tethered through the way that you go to recruit things, and so it's just like more like riding a bike at that point. You've got all the same parts at their current strength right now. When you're going to go ride a bike, like what was the transition between riding a bike and not riding a bike? It was just, you got it. Like you figured out how to recruit and that patterning. I find that for many people, that's the starting point way before we go into anything else. And same thing goes for like when they lift their arm, they can't really use their glenohumeral joint. I call it movement in the shoulder, movement of the shoulder. They're moving the whole scapula is unstable when they go to move their arm because the glenohumeral joint doesn't have enough range of motion. And they don't know it because their arm goes all the way up, it goes all the way back, it goes all the way across. But meanwhile, the scapula was going 100% everywhere. And you could miss, especially in people who are hypermobile, that the glenohumeral joint didn't actually articulate at all. Barely articulated. Same thing with hamstrings, right? You can have someone touch the floor, no problem, but their hip joints don't actually articulate. And so that is someone who then will tend to always move from the spine, very rarely from the hips, but they'll pass all the movement tests if you don't have that eagle eye on what am I giving this test for? The test isn't can you touch the ground? The test is, are your hips getting the mechanical nutrients they need? So it's just to keep that refined eye is what I'm most interested in.
Thank you so much. And as a final sort of words for today, do you have any other thoughts for physical therapists who are working with people typically one-on-one for these movement related pain problems?
I think context is key. Just to keep think of context, and also keep it simple. I think the adherence for people doing their corrective exercises is best when it's like 2. More than 2, it's very challenging. Like people are more successful when they're given 2 versus 8. That was one particular study that looked at volume. So if you can find the one thing that you think would be the most important for the person and then contextualize it to their home. If you do home stuff, it tends to stick better. But at minimum, it's like, I want you to do this on your name. You name me. Don't tell them where to do it. You ask them, where are 3 places you could do this particular move in your house? It's like a teaching tool that you do with kids, so then they're involved in the process. It's not so like, just being bossed around and told what to do. Nobody likes that. None of us like that. We have a hard time uptaking what other people tell us to do. So when you phrase things like, where would fitting in an exercise like this work for you? Let them come up with the when, let them come up with the where. You can even do it while you're teaching it, right? Like you've got them in this motor sensation and you're getting them to visualize and think about where they're going to do it in their own life. Could you do this on your steering wheel? Like give them some really key activities of daily living application, and then try to tie it back to what they value beyond just being out of pain. What aren't you able to do? Because then you've highlighted their value. Then you've highlighted their passion. And now you've contextualized the exercise you're giving them as something that gets them to the thing they want to do. Being out of pain is not an activity. And I don't say that to diminish anyone who's suffering with pain. Like I'm trying to hold space. I understand how overwhelming that is and how just getting out of pain becomes the life focus. But even at that point, you have to imagine what's on the other side. You have to connect all of this therapy, right? Which is homework. Nobody ever wants to do homework. You have to give it like some other aspirational thing. And then that is it's much better for the client.
Well, it really matches from how we think about pain standpoint too, because pain is so contextual and so tied to an environment and a situation. So if we can get clients to start thinking about prescribing the exercises that way, it builds in all the stuff that we want on the other side anyways.
And that's how you integrate. We recognize that really life is very pain inducing. It's stress inducing. It's very hard right now. And so we need this sort of hopeful, positive thing that we can aspire to. And if we can make therapy feel more like a conduit to that and make it feel differently and feel like it's like, oh, no, you're choosing to do this. Not like my doctor said I have to come. No, you're choosing to do this. This is going to get you to the other thing that you chose, and like it just puts people back in the driver's seat of their own life, which I think is very important to well-being and pain management overall.
I could not agree more, as I've said so many times in this conversation today. And I am so thankful for your time. And I'm sure all of the listeners will be as well. So thank you very much, Katy
Thank you
Bowman.
for having me.
Check out, you're welcome. Her books, I love the Move Your DNA book, and the most recent one, Rethink Your Position, I thought was so extremely helpful, especially from a physical therapy mindset. So thank you so much.
Thank you.